Hi, it's Mandy Kirk. I'm a creative producer at Prologis, and I want to welcome you to Moving the World, the podcast where we unpack the ideas, technologies, and people reshaping global logistics. In this episode, Will O'Donnell of Prologis Ventures and Craig Fuller of FreightWaves break down what's driving change in the freight industry. And they talk about where it's headed next, whether that's AI, automation, or more volatility. So, let's get moving.
Well, Craig, thank you for being here with me today. So, we're going to start off with a little bit of an icebreaker. And for those out there who don't know, FreightWaves at their headquarters has a collection of college football helmets, I think from each of the employees where they went to college. And Craig happens to be a big college football fan. So, I want to start with asking your perspective. We're obviously in some turbulent times with the NIL's transfer portal, and college football is about to get underway. But what do you feel about PE firms' involvement in college athletics these days?
Will, I think college football is underway. We had first set of games this past weekend. It's always a favorite time of the year. I'm from the South. There is no such thing as the no fun league in the South, even though we have the Falcons and the Titans and the Florida teams. But this is the most exciting time. Growing up in Tennessee, this is a big SEC country. Look, private equity getting into college football, I think, is inevitable from where I sit. I mean, the reality is that college football is one of the largest sports leagues in the entire country. I think it's number 2 in terms of dollars, at least media dollars of total league, billions of dollars a year just in TV contracts. And so I'm fully supportive. Honestly, if I could own the Baylor Bears, I neither have the money nor the ability currently to buy the Baylor Bears, but I would be right there. Schools like Baylor, which is where I went to school, my son has just entered Baylor University.
Yeah, congratulations. I saw you moved them in this weekend.
Sick 'em Bears.
With that, let's actually switch to the topic on hand, transportation and freight and data. I think what's interesting is the ability to really look through transportation, look at the data, and see what the impact and the predictions that can occur on the economy as large from what's happening in the transportation market. I know that's something you're very passionate about, both in personal interactions, but in social media and on TV at times. But I think it'll be interesting. A lot of times, trucking data and transportation data is the canary in the coal mine. So, talk a little bit about how you look at it perceptionally, what's important, and why you are so passionate about freight markets.
I mean, look, I think freight is the source of truth for the goods economy. If you sort of about the fact that everything that is consumed that's physical at some point ends up in a transportation network. And we could even go as far to say that the pipe and even the Department of Transportation.
Yeah, I mean, even before it gets made, it ends in transportation market.
Well, I mean, a pipe, if we're talking oil or even water, that's still it's been transported just through the methodologies of the pipe all the way to, like air freight and trucks. And so for me, I've always been interested in sort of the economy and in business. And the goods economy is all about freight. I mean, I grew up in the trucking business. My dad started and built what became a large trucking company. Yeah. If there was such thing as a big trucking, I am a creature of it. I've been around it and I fell in love with it. But what I've always loved about freight is that it is really reflective of the goods economy, or as most people like to say, the Main Street economy. And I think that's true. And I think freight and freight data tells us a lot about what's actually happening in the goods economy, better so than practically any other data source. And so, and the proof.
Because it's instantaneous. Like in our business, we sign leases, they're long-term leases. Trucking, it's a day-to-day contract, essentially, especially when you look at spot.
Real-time transaction set. The thing that's really interesting about freight, unlike other types of commodities, because I think we have to, first of all, describe freight as a commodity, which I think confuses a lot of people because they think of commodities being like wheat, oil, gold as a commodity.
Well, orange
Freight
juice
is
from yeah, right?
Orange juice,
right?
Frozen concentrated orange juice, Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd in Trading Places. I think it's where we all learned what the Chicago Board of Trade was. I know. I think people are like, who? These guys are old. There's an old Eddie Murphy. I recommend that movie. It's a great movie. And if you ever watch Coming to America, actually, there's a scene.
They are out. Yes,
where Voldemort. What was
they're on the stairs and
the two guys.
That's right.
Yeah, Mortimer or whatever, and he hands the cash, to them, and they're back in the game, so, I love that movie, but, freight is a commodity, and it's the commodity unlike other commodities, like, I can store oil in the ground. I can store wheat in a, silo. I cannot store freight, and people do not move freight unless there's demand on the other side of the table, and so, in other words, no one's moving things around for the sake of moving them around, but I can buy oil and store it in a big bunker, and it be something that I'm doing to essentially speculate on the market. It is true that most people just buy futures contracts to speculate, but there are occasions where people buy physical property commodities to effectively corner the market or at least store it for future value, whereas freight, you can't do that. So one of the things about freight is freight volume is reflective of the total amount of goods in the economy. The other thing about freight that I think is really interesting as an index itself is freight tells us a lot about the volume of product that's moving through the economy different than the dollars, because I think a lot of economists get caught up in the total amount of money that flows around. And the problem is, like, you think about the more expensive items tend to be like a wealthy person, the amount of stuff that they consume in terms of goods quantity is not directly correlated to their wealth versus a poor person. So a poor person is consuming, but at the end of the day, I might think of just like bottled water. Like if someone is living below paycheck to paycheck, they may be drinking from the tap water or they may be drinking low end bottled water, whereas a wealthy person may pick up the $10 bottle of Saratoga. At the end of the day, it's still quantity of one. And I think what freight tells us about and freight volume tells us about is a lot of the underlying economic conditions in the market. And it tells us a lot about sort of the state of what's happening in real time. Because again, people do not move product unless there's a demand on the other side. Someone ultimately has to be pulling that freight across their network. They're not going to move it for the sake of moving it. And other commodities, you don't get that advantage.
Interesting because you simultaneously have a macro viewpoint, but then a very micro viewpoint where you can look at specific geographies, municipalities, zip codes, etc., and see real time the impact. At the same time, you can zoom out and see across the global economy or across the U.S. what's happening. Then obviously make differentiations on import exports and see what's happening in specific markets, which can tell you the health directionally of where things may be going.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think a really good example of that is flatbeds. The flatbed, which is the truck, for those that may not be familiar with what a flatbed is, it's the truck without a box around it. So effectively, most trucking is in a box, but then you have these trucks and typically hauling things like heavy steel, hauling lumber. You see them at job sites, construction sites. I think, Will, when Prologis is building a warehouse, when you're building a location, there's a ton of flatbed going in and out of there, right? And flatbeds tell us there's a high correlation of the flatbed market and flatbed demand to housing. So one of the things that we like to do is actually look at single family home starts, which is a barometer of sort of economic activity in the housing market. By looking at flatbed demand data on a daily basis, will predict housing starts. And it's not 100% correlated, but you can get into, an 80 to 90% correlation sometimes, like many times, largely because if I'm moving product, if I'm moving lumber across the economy or building materials across the economy, a large percent of that moves on flatbed, and therefore, if the housing market is down, if I'm moving product, if I'm moving lumber across the economy or building materials across the economy, a large percent of that moves on flatbed, and therefore, if the housing market is down, chances are that your flatbed market's gonna be down. If people are not building homes, then they're not consuming the types of materials that need to go into those homes, and so we look at that as a high, very important factor in driving the freight market. And the housing market specifically, just in trucking, is probably 20% of the trucking market, is a massively important market,
Mhm.
for the overall freight market. And this is a year where the housing market is not doing well, as anyone who studies housing knows. And that means that large portions of the trucking market are gonna be really soft.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is one of those essential leading indicators where, in order for us to build new houses or build new warehouses, we actually have to move the equipment. At the same time, with inventory replenishment at retail stores, the inventory actually has to get to the store before they can sell it. So if I'm looking retroactively at sales figures, well, by looking at the inventory movements well in advance, I could get directly understanding whether things are projected to increase or not. What are some of the, like, you gave a good example of the flatbeds, but what are some of the other nuanced data areas within transportation that you really like to zero in because they are good leading indicators?
I like to look, I mean, ultimately, we have at Sonar is a data business that we track. Think of it as ultimately, it's often called the Bloomberg of freight. Think of it a Bloomberg tool. And in a Bloomberg terminal, you got all this data from across the economy and across financial markets, whether it's commodity data, currencies, fixed income, or equities. Bloomberg is sort of is known as the hub for all that data. We do the same thing in our product called Sonar, and
Mhm.
really we think of the sort of core benchmarks of freight to be our OTVI, which is our outbound tender volume index, which really tracks the volume of trucking transactions. So it doesn't track what people are paying for freight; it's tracking the volume transactions.
Explain how the tender works, the process, whether it's going up or down.
So a tender is really just an order. Think of it as an order that comes from a shipper. So in our world, a shipper is defined as someone who's buying transportation services. I think sometimes major media confuses a shipper. They call transportation company shippers, but in our world, a shipper is a purchaser of transportation.
So that would be a retailer and
They could be, an example would be like a Walmart, a Procter and Gamble. It could be a Tesla. It could be a Nestle Water.
anyone who's purchasing the goods that are being moved.
Yeah, so they're buying transportation to move a product or products that they are selling to some other party. Now it could be products that is wholesale to go into like if I'm Hershey's chocolate, I might be moving chocolate from my chocolate factory to my finished goods factory. But you're moving something because you need to run it. And that's what a shipper does. And so the outbound tender volume is looking at the number of orders. It's an index, the number of orders that come from one party, i.e. a shipper, to a carrier. And a carrier is most of the time someone who owns trucks, but it could very well be a third-party logistics company, and increasingly so. And so we're tracking the number of transactions, and we index those transactions to tell us whether demand today and demand over the past 7 years is higher or lower. And that index tells us sort of real time within 24 hours, what does the demand cycle look like? And that is probably as close of an economic indicator you can have to the physical goods economy. We're getting transactional data, and then what we do is we create an anonymized and aggregated index that tells us what is the volume in the freight economy at any moment in time. So the data that we tracks volume data, so tracking the volume of transactions. We also track what we call the tender rejection index. It's not what it sounds like, although it operates a lot like the tender does, where you think about it, if you're more desirable, if you have more options, you're doing a lot more rejections. And it's the same thing in freight markets. If you are more desirable, if you have better options as a trucking company, you're rejecting a lot. And that's tender rejection is. Those tenders are actually orders. That tender volume data is the same thing. That tender rejection tells us whether trucking companies have better options. And when they have better options, because the market is better, it tells us that really, and particularly if it's increasing, the market's getting better, it's firming, that trucking company operating conditions are better. We're seeing it in a really weird situation because we're seeing really soft volume, but the projections are sort of holding their own at about 5.5%, which is not a great number.
What's a normalized number that you would kind of say healthy?
It's within a range, like a trading range, right? And I think what it tells us is that a lot of the excess capacity is out of the market and continues to be removed out of the market, and that's sort of what's happening.
But then overall, the amount of goods itself is below.
Is soft. It is below, to put this in perspective, we are below 2019 levels, which is really, really, really strange. And because it's fallen so significantly. And I think what's happened is that the just business confidence is challenged right now. There's a lot of uncertainty just in where things are headed, a lot of unpredictability. And some of this is by design. I mean, this is sort of the administration's policies, but it's also a situation where I think there was so much stimulus during COVID that under the Biden administration by Congress that we still are in some ways dealing with those hangovers. And I think one of the things that has been talked a lot about in economic circles is that you have these waves of recessions. In most recessions, you sort of have a relatively predictable pattern where one industry falls apart and the rest of them follow. Because of the COVID excesses created all sorts of distortions in the economy, is that we've had waves upon waves of recessions, and we're still somewhat dealing with it, 3 years later.
It's almost, I mean, to some degree, I mean, I've always used it like things resort to the mean. So when you end up, and if things are running on a scale 1 to 10, things are running at a 12, okay, at some point it's going to go back to the historical average of 7 or 8. But that pain of going from a highly exuberant market to something that's more normalized, that's where I've seen a lot of kind of the situation is that you just can't continue running that hot. And that's what causes inflation.
You can't, but here's the problem is that a lot of investments were made during COVID. Even how the housing market's a perfect example of this is we ended up in some markets increasing housing prices by, in some markets they doubled, prices doubled. I mean, there are examples of, and I'm sure you know people that in your world, my father was telling me about a friend of his down in South Florida who had a house that had basically he bought pre-COVID. It doubled in price at the end of COVID, and now has come back to sort of it's like
The normalized price, what it would have been.
it's up 50% from where it was, but it's in 6 months it's dropped another 30%. So it's just weird because these distortions, particularly in the housing market, had made it almost impossible for people who own a home to get to sell that house. The low mortgage rates, and frankly, where would they go? And then it's made people who didn't get into the housing market, they can't access the housing market because they can't afford to buy a home. It's not even interest rate related. There's some of that. But then you have builders who aren't building because they don't know what the housing market looks like, and interest rates have made it so inaccessible, plus inflation. So I think these distortions, you definitely resort back to the mean, but there has been long-term damage that has been caused by this overstimulus that we're still dealing with. And I think housing is the most obvious place where that's the case.
So switching topics to the one du jour, which is AI. You run a data company. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around AI and with the possibilities and the transformational. So two questions here. We'll start with the first one being, how is you as a CEO of a data company view it? And then after we talk through that, we'll switch into practices from companies leveraging your data and AI tools within their operations. But first, start from your own perspective as you're looking at Sonar. How do you see the opportunity of AI? I know that you're coming out with a new product release that's leveraging it, but what excites you? Where is the hype too much, and kind of where are you kind of on the gradual curve on? I guess AI is definitely not a gradual curve.
No, it's an exponential. Like I am incredibly bullish on it because I think it's a technology. It's interesting because what we have found in our own models is that AI is actually not great working with time series data. Like it isn't yet. A lot of the AI models are built
How so?
just because the way they work is a lot of contextual. A lot of these language learning models
Oh,
are very contextual based. When you have time series data that you need to add new data inputs every single day, they make predictions and sometimes will pull data points from a different date range. If I were to ask a question, what is the tender rejection data? It might pull a random date and give it to you as a fact. And you see this even in like Grok and ChatGPT, where you ask a question and it is not as good at understanding time series intelligence. Best example if I can get this is I was asking Grok last night about an aviation regulation that the government changed on July 27th. And I was curious about this regulation, and it told me this is what the regulation says. And I'm like, I don't think that's right. And what it had done was It had taken historical context that had written before the regulation had done, and it pulled in these facts that had some out-of-date perspectives on what the regulation was. And you see it too in data models that if I ask it what the tender rejection rate today is, or I ask it what the tender rejection is, it might pull something from 3 weeks ago. It might pull
Yeah.
something from 6 months ago. So we have found it to be poorly positioned today for those things. It will get better. You have to be pretty specific.
Yeah, it makes sense because it's doing there's a binary, so regulation changes. July 26th, it was one rule. July 28th, it's a different rule. It isn't distinguishing.
Even when I told it, "Hey, it's the new rule," but what it was doing was it was pulling content that was written about
Could
what was
happen.
expected to come into the new rule, and then it says, "This is gospel," and I'm like, "No, I know better." What we found is it is really good at contextualizing data. One of the value propositions that we have at Sonar is that we take all these data sets, and it's we publish 4.5 million time series data points every single day, and one of the big things that customers want is how is the data actionable to them? How can they use this information? And look, everything we do, our market experts are pretty formulaic. Like, I don't have to go in and prep for, we do a state of freight monthly call with Zach Strickland and I do. I don't have to prep for it because I can look at the chart on a screen and be like, that's what's happening. I don't have to know a ton of stuff. We think AI can do those things. And we think AI, these language learning models, are really good at contextualizing information. What they're really good at is providing so you can get into, I want to know specifically what I should do as an executive in this sector. So let's say that I run an auto plant supply chain. AI can create a very custom set of intelligence that pertains to me, but is irrelevant to a beverage manufacturer. And so what we're doing with AI is trying to take the data we have and bring context into it. The communications of humans is obviously natural language. And what we're trying to do is contextualize the data. I think that is an enormous resource. I think AI is incredibly valuable in things like content production. We use it for everything from copy editing to helping people formulate content. And I'm incredibly bullish there. Where it is challenging is it is still not yet at a place where it has an understanding of sort of time series data of what someone's asking about on a specific data point. And it's not as good as we hope it will be in providing a lot of the sort of forecasting that you want in the future because it doesn't have all the context. And one of the things I think these models fail at is when you ask it to make predictions of things, if you don't give it enough information, it will hallucinate and make up stuff that is irrelevant.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, where I find it most helpful in using it, and a lot of my role is how do I look across a wide variety of data sources or information and make decisions? So a lot of historically what we've done is spend a lot of time researching, pulling market maps, reading papers, etc. And 80-90% of the time may have been spent assimilating, collecting, and categorizing information so then you can make a decision. If I can do that same process and make better decisions by connecting more pieces in a much faster manner, one, the inputs that I'm using to help make a decision, it's broader. Two, the velocity of making decisions is faster. And I think one of the biggest opportunities within supply chain, I'd love to hear your take on this, is AI is never going to predict with 100% certainty what's going to happen in supply chain, just because there's too many black swan events, whether it's natural disasters, whether it's geopolitical issues. We can just go through it. However, a resilient supply chain is one that can respond to these issues and adjust. And I think the faster you can pull information together and give the decision makers the information insights they need at their fingertips, the faster would be able to respond and then restructure supply chains.
You know, it's interesting. It is exactly that. To your point, it doesn't understand things outside of the context that it. So AI is incredibly powerful if it has enough context to the problem you're solving. It is actually quite weak and makes really bad decisions if it doesn't have all the context. And that's where supply chains, specifically moving physical products across the world, end up getting disrupted because a lot of the way that the logistics industry responds to things is what we call exception management. I mean, if you think about the 10,000 people that work at Expeditors, or the 100,000 people that work in FedEx's operations, the vast majority of their time isn't ensuring products moving from point A to point B.
It's doing the exception management.
It is dealing with if you're FedEx, it's the shipments that have been misrouted, maybe damaged. If you're Expeditors, perhaps it's dealing with a ship that, got attacked by pirates, or dealing with, some regulatory issue, or some ship didn't show up when it was supposed to, or truck didn't show up. They're having to deal with the exceptions. When things work, you actually don't need logistics professionals. And this is where AI actually adds an enormous amount of value, is that you can tell AI, do this thing that is repeatable and let me know if there's a problem with it, right? That's really where it's exceptional. And that's eliminating the human need to have people manage and monitor. Where it doesn't yet work is in these sort of simulation exercises, or I should say like disruption issues, where experience matters. There's not a playbook for it, and having that human intellect step in is really important. But I do think what it does is it takes a lot of workload off of the day-to-day monotonous part of the jobs that can help companies respond to these things much faster, be much more aware. And that's where I think it's exceptional. I mean, in just content production, things like copy editing. We used to have a team of copy editors. We still have some copy editors, but now we're using a lot of AI. If you've ever followed my X account, I'm really bad at grammar. And so I copy edit. It's funny, my son's going to Baylor, and his mom's like, "Hey, I want you to write a letter to him." And so I did. I wrote a letter to him. I wrote it, and I copy edited everything through Grok, and it came back with some telltale signs that AI had edited it, which was I think the M dash was everybody's favorite. Well, my son goes, "Did you use AI for this?" And I'm like, "No, I actually wrote it, but it was copy edited." But those are kind of examples of where it's actually really good. I do think that one of the coolest use cases is to upload a favorite book. So let's say you have a competitor, and I've done this, and you're like, I need an old like philosopher, a maritime, like I need to know what Napoleon Bonaparte would do, or I need The Art of War, Sun Tzu. Here's the situation. Here are the facts that you should know. Give me some advice on what Napoleon would tell me to go do in this situation. Like, I've got challenging issue here, and I found it to be actually really good because it will diagnose the problem. And you're like, I'm thinking about, these are the three choices, and it will tell you which one Napoleon would do based on his history. I just think that's one of the most fun use cases.
One of the fundamental value propositions of diversity is diversity of perspective. And really what you described there is you can take exceptionally hard problems and with AI suddenly get a diversity of perspectives on how you would view it. And you're like, in that case, it was, I want to know how Napoleon would attack this. And you could choose a completely different
Just tell it.
perspective.
It's such a cool thing. Upload it, tell it to reference a book and be like, hey, I want you to pretend to be Napoleon or Napoleon's advisor. What would he do in this situation? And I actually found it to be really good because it gives you a chance to sort of think about a perspective on what is the strategy. And like business leaders, particularly CEOs, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about business strategy. And now you have the benefit of an expert on Napoleon, let's say, an expert on Sun Tzu that's going to tell you this is what the art of war would tell you to do. And it's really cool. It's a different way to think of it.
So as we start wrapping up, looking ahead, you obviously have a ton of insight, data, perspective on what's happening in our freight markets. What would your general guidance and advice be for executives as we're leaning into a time that is confusing, there is uncertainty? How should we be thinking about leveraging data, but also how should we be thinking about the next 12, 24 months and running our businesses?
I think the facts are pretty clear that the world that we knew, that I grew up in, and you and I are in the same generation, the world that we grew up in post the Berlin Wall, mass peace, that peace dividend's gone. And I think we're in a world that's much more contested and much more unstable. And that means that supply chains are going to be subject to disruption and continue to be subject to disruption. So my number one piece of advice for anyone thinking about their supply chain or thinking about their operations is to expect more disruption. You need to have contingency plans in place. You need to make the investments in data because data will tell you really the source of truth on the ground. But you also need to have people that you're surrounded with that have experience. One of the biggest failures I think Silicon Valley has gotten wrong as it relates to investing in supply chain is when they don't invest in teams that actually have pedigrees. And I know, Will, you do a lot of investing in supply chain. You're very active. You're one of the most active investors in this space. But I do a lot of seed investing. These are small check, $10 to $50,000 checks. One of my number one criteria of talking to a founder isn't whether they have the technical chops. It's whether they have the experience of being in the industry. And I think you can look at supply chain and investments and you can look at the top and most successful companies in the space. The most common theme of that is that they had at least one founder had worked in the industry for a couple of years. Like they had understood why this isn't so like there's so many problems and you're like, "Oh, this is so easy. Why haven't they figured this out?" And then you get into it and you're like, "Oh yeah, like there's reasons that this operates the way it is." And I think founders that have that experience understand it. And it's just like if you're operating a large corporation with a large supply chain, you want to have a team that has been through these issues. If you're thinking about moving a supply chain from one country to another, you want to have on-ground expertise of people who have been in those countries for many years. If you're thinking about moving to different modes of traffic, you want to have people who have experience on those lanes and have been involved in it. So experience really matters, and I think that's what's going to win out here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I always found amusing was VCs and investors like the pattern recognition. So 4 or 5 years ago, it was Uber of everything. And the reality is, like, Uber has one business model. If the car I've called for Uber doesn't show up, they'll just send another one, and I'm fine with that. The car's fine. In freight, like, if the truck doesn't show up and I have $500,000 of goods in the back of that truck, that's a major issue. So it gets into the exception management. I really liked the discussion on experience because it's like the Greek tragedy. Your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. Like, people who have done the same thing for 20 years, they have a deep expertise, but it's also what made them efficient. I think the people who have been transformational and built, such as yourself, a company that's really done something different, is they took that expertise, but then realized what constraints may have existed by how we did business or how technology or data can change it. And they removed constraints in the industry to go in a different direction.
I think there's also something, if you take FreightWaves as an example, I took Michael Bloomberg's book, his biography.
And you had Napoleon tell you how to run it?
I should have had an AI and he could have, I might try this. But I took a playbook from a different industry, applied it to my organic knowledge of freight. And like, I think this is a common theme I see in a lot of founders that have freight experience that have been incredibly successful. Ryan Peterson, he applied a lot of software technology, was able to get people, but he still had an understanding of how the industry works. The most successful recent founder in freight is Jordan Graff at Highway. They just just sold a piece of the business to a private equity firm for $535 million. That is arguably the most successful of the latest generation companies. And his playbook was he worked in banking, worked for a bank, worked for Triumph Bank. He understood fraud was a problem. And he looked at how the bank solved fraud in financial transactions and said, I've been in freight for 4 years. I can take the banking playbook for solving fraud and apply it to freight management issues. So he took his domain expertise in freight and is sort of blended in a lot of the ways that banks handle fraud and their credit card companies handle fraud and applied it. And I think that's kind of the special formula, Will, it's taken a founder that understands the industry and the nuances and the reasons things exist the way they do, which is so weird to outsiders, but applying a playbook that has worked and been successful in another industry, in an adjacent industry perhaps, and using it to solve these problems in freight.
Yeah, it's one of the things I personally spend a lot of time on, adjacent learnings. And the crude analogy I use in college, it was plagiarism, but in business, it's efficiency. So if someone figured out how to start on second or third base and do something efficiently, like, I need to tweak it for my situation. But how do I bring that in and allow us to accelerate faster? And I think to your point, someone who comes in and this happens, I think, across B2B companies and a lot of industries, especially O-line physical industries, are complex and really hard, and they operate for a certain reason. But if you can figure out adjacent learnings, how to apply technology, and I think this is where you and I and the rest of the world is so excited about AI, the transformational opportunities to learn faster, pull information, and connect dots should help us remove constraints and make decisions faster. But I think your time critical or the time series shortcomings right now are a good kind of lesson that you still need humans in the loop, and you still need to be able to direct and make the right decisions. You just theoretically can get better information by using things like AI. And kind of as we wrap on this, I think it's called supply chain for a reason, because you have all these interconnected pieces. And one of the maxims that I've heard over and over about the industry is your supply chain's only as strong as the weakest link. Part of what I love about the industry is the challenge of how do you get hundreds of disparate companies, each operating their own individual piece, to actually work together to move physical goods.
And Mill, let's be honest, even inside of those own companies, they can't sometimes their own data doesn't talk to one another. I don't think this is the crazy part of this business. None of your customers, they all work great. Computers are all talking to one another. Supply chains are a mess, and this is where the opportunities lie, is that they are a mess. They are interdependent, but even inside companies themselves,
It works. That's the thing. Even with it a mess today, it still works.
it works because we've built so many things to help make it work.
That's true.
Because the exceptions have become the rule in how we build things, and every piece of software, every process has been created because somebody did something. It's like the don't eat the stuff you get. It's because somebody ate that, right? That's why the warning labels are on something, like somebody did that. So
Hey, well, thank you very much. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat, and I look forward to our next conversation.
see you, Will.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Moving the World. Big thanks to Will O'Donnell and Craig Fuller for joining us. Be sure to follow the show for more conversations on the future of logistics. Until next time, keep moving.